Welcome to Power Hour. The Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance is the only nonprofit organization whose sole focus is serving the community of children anywhere on the epilepsy surgery journey, from the point of drug resistance through surgery and including the transition to adulthood and beyond. We empower families with research, support services, and impactful programs before, during, and after surgery. We were formerly known as the Brain Recovery Project, and we are in our 12th year of serving this community. Power Hour sessions are brought to you by our corporate sponsor, UCB. And today we're going to talk about transition in the IEP process. And transition, there are many transitions in life, but this particular presentation is about how to use the IEP to support your child's transition to adulthood, or if you're a clinician or someone or an educator or someone working with a child, how you would support the family through that process. And just to give you a little bit of background about how do I know this and why does it matter? To me, my son, sorry, I'm trying to do multitask, which I can't do because I'm 55. My son Bennett had a stroke in utero and had the right hemisphere of his brain removed at age 2 to stop a catastrophic form of epilepsy called infantile spasms. And surgery was successful. His last seizure was the morning of surgery. And he is seizure-free. He's been seizure-free for, let's see, he's 19. He's been seizure-free for about 17 years. And he's a freshman in college. But the path to getting him from where he was as a baby to today has been excruciating. And along the way, I had to become a special education advocate for my son, and ultimately ended up starting to do that for lots of other families, and then eventually received training to be a special education advocate through the Council of Parent Advocates and Attorneys, which is a great organization to know about if you don't already. And my role now at Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance is to help families navigate the educational system, develop IEPs. I do provide we don't provide direct advocacy, but we provide parent training, and we also have informal power hours that are Q&As, which I hope you'll attend later this summer. We have a couple coming up so that you can get any specific questions answered. For today's presentation, I'm going to move a little quickly. There's a lot of content to cover. You will be receiving a PowerPoint of the slides and some other resources that I'll be sharing with you. If you have a question that you feel needs to be answered during the presentation, put it in the chat. And if I think it's relevant and I'm at a good stopping point, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'll leave a few minutes at the end of today. And then next week for part 2, it'll be about 20 minutes of Q&A. So we'll hopefully be able to do a lot more of the questions next week once I've presented all of the information. I'm hoping the presentation has everything that you need to know. What else do I need to tell you? All right, so let's start. As I began to research transition over the past 10 years, I've really done a deep dive in transition because my son was approaching it, and through my work at PISA, I realized that transition is sort of like the dirty secret of special education. We spent all of these years trying to build these perfect IEPs for our children. You can have a beautiful IEP in elementary school, all the right services in middle school, and then you get to high school. And what I see is that so often the school is just pushing the kid through and not really providing what's needed. So today, I'm hopefully going to give you an overview of how to view the transition planning process, what's needed, what assessments are needed, and then what to do with that information. I really like going back to the law. If you read the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act and the regulations that accompany it, everything that is written in the law is very specific. So I love to go back to it and reference what the law says, because it helps frame this conversation and helps us make sense of this very complex topic. So this quote here is the preamble to the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which guarantees our children special education and services, right? So what Congress said when they wrote this law is that disability is a natural part of the human experience. Disability does not diminish the right of individuals to participate or contribute in society, and that improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. Did you note that they don't say individuals with certain disabilities? They don't say individuals with disabilities who are earning a diploma. They don't say individuals with disabilities who are verbal. They don't say individuals with disabilities who have an intact brain, right? So they're talking about all individuals with disabilities are entitled to the rights that are outlined in this document. And this is in the beginning where they're setting it up and they're saying this is what. So what I see often is there's school teams who assume that this statement, which is an essential part of the IEP, of IDEA language, is about other students, not about the student we're discussing in this particular IEP meeting, right? But this law does apply to all students. The level of disability is irrelevant. So when we think about what transition is, regardless of their disabilities, all children eventually become adults, physically and legally, right? So developmentally, your child might be younger, but at 18, they're a legal adult. I think there's the age of majority is a little bit different in a couple of states in the US. So the purpose of planning for transition is for you as parents or a school team or clinicians to help the family with this. Look ahead at the child's future life. What do you see? What do you want to see, right? What goals are you setting in life for this individual? And decide what supports and services are needed to help them be successful in that life you envision. And you might have to support them with getting through college, finding employment, enrolling in a day program, managing their medical appointments, getting around their neighborhood, or finding a place to live. But that doesn't mean they can't do those things. They might do a supported adult life, right? But that's okay. But you're starting to think about what is it going to look like and what level of support will they need. This goes beyond school, job, or living. What quality of life do you envision for your child as an adult? What community engagement will they be able to access? What support will they need? If you look at the literature on adults in adults with disabilities, the more significant disabilities, only 1/3 of those individuals have interaction, community engagement throughout the week, and only 1/3 say they have a friend or someone that they see more than once a week. And so I think community engagement, we focus a lot on academic and life skills and all of that, but what is their social and quality of life, their community going to be when they're adults? Today, I'm going to go over a few things that can help you start to build this framework. Some of it will happen within the IEP process, which is the foundation of today's talk, but also there's so much that as parents we're going to be doing at home. Transition is a stressful time for all kids, right? So, and for our kids, it is especially hard. It's a major shift for students with disabilities to leave the structured setting of high school or their transition program. And when I say leave high school, I mean either earning a diploma at age 18 or graduating out of the transition program. And I'll explain those differences in a minute, because they lose the support of an entire educational team and related services and all of that. And they enter the real world where the demands for self-determination, organization, and independence are suddenly much greater. So they need to really learn about you as families, and the individuals, the students themselves need to learn about the big changes that are going to occur in nearly every aspect of their lives. I recently heard a presenter who I really love. Her name is Michelle Garcia Winner, and she's the social thinking guru, I like to call her. She's here in California. And she talked about a young man that she was supporting with his executive function challenges. And he thought that once he graduated, what it meant was that he was no longer going to have an IEP and nobody was going to tell him what to do anymore. But he didn't understand what was going to change for him in the way, the structure of his life and his responsibilities and needs. So hopefully today we'll lay a framework for what that's going to look like. So under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA, students with disabilities are entitled to a free appropriate public education, or FAPE. There's a lot of acronyms in special ed. I'm going to try to say them all out, but as you are going through this, hopefully you've learned them. And if you haven't, you might need to start researching and learning some of these special ed acronyms. And the law says that they are entitled to FAPE with related services designed to meet the child's unique needs and prepare the child for further education, employment, and independent living. So what that means is the entire purpose of an IEP is to prepare the child for further education, employment, and independent living. So if this is not the foundational goal in every single IEP meeting, starting from kindergarten really, but certainly by middle school, then you're not setting your student up for success. The main purpose of IDEA is to ensure that children with disabilities are prepared to lead productive and independent adult lives to the maximum extent possible. That's a quote from Congress, right? Transition planning should help the student with a disability exit high school ready to start the rest of their life. So the last day of their high school or transition program shouldn't be like, oh my God, now what? They should have the next thing, whatever it's going to be, set up, ready to step into. And we'll talk about what that's going to look like. Did you have a plan for your life in place at age 16? I'm guessing not. I know I didn't. I did not have any plans at 16, right? But when you have a child with a complex disability, a child with a neurological disorder, epilepsy, history of brain surgery, all of that, your child might need more support to transition than you did. And the purpose of transition services is to prepare the student to move from the world of school to the world of adulthood. The last stated purpose of IDEA is to ensure the effectiveness of education for children with disabilities. So part of an effective education is to make sure that the student has skills, knowledge, and the ability to function outside of school. Because remember, they just said the purpose of IDEA is to prepare the student to lead productive and independent lives to the maximum extent possible. So they're talking about outside of school. So when we think about when should we start thinking about transition, it's never too early to start thinking about transition. I did once work with a family who had a daughter who had a hemispherectomy, and we were talking about transition in her kindergarten IEP. In her case, she had a very complex array of disabilities, including she was deaf and peripheral deafness and had blindness from the hemianopia from hemispherectomy. So there was a different framework where they had to think about deaf-blind schools and that sort of thing, but they were talking about it in kindergarten. You can start wherever you are right now by researching the federal and state laws and regulations related to transition and considering what skills will be needed to prepare your child for their future life. Our organization created a 100-page guide and also a free course that's about, I think it's about 12 hours long with tons and tons of resources. It's a self-paced course. I will be sharing those links with you after today's presentation. All of this information is in there, including information about the federal laws. I don't do state because you have to look up your own state laws, but this is something you need to start becoming familiar with so you understand. The law says, the IDEA says that the transition IEP, which is an IEP at transition age, it's nothing fancy, right? It just means the IEP at transition age with the transition goals and based on the transition assessment must be in place by the student's 16th birthday. That's what the federal law says. Some states have provisions that say, well, actually, it has to be by their 14th birthday or their 12th birthday. So you need to know based on your state. But the law also says if the team feels it's necessary, they can start the transition planning earlier. So the latest would be age 15. You would be meeting with your team to talk about what transition assessments are needed so that and starting to develop that IEP, because by their 16th birthday, the transition IEP needs to be in place with transition goals and services outlined based on that transition assessment. My son, because of his level of complexity, he literally had every box checked on the IEP. When you have half a brain, you kind of have half of everything impacted. And so he really had a very complex IEP. I asked at age 13 when he was in 8th grade, his IEP team, I'd like to start transition planning now because he is so complex. He needs more time to practice skills. We might need to extend the runway by extending high school or doing some other things. So I want to start now, and they agreed. So we started his transition planning then. Even though we're in California, our California state law does not require earlier transition planning, but you can do it if the team agrees. Best practices, if you look in the literature, is to start much younger, right? So you really, again, transition is something you should be thinking about throughout childhood. And high school might be too late to begin transition planning for a child with complex medical, academic, social, emotional, and functional needs. If you have a very complex child, there's no reason not to ask the team to start the process earlier. And don't wait to start the day before their 16th birthday, right? You really need to make sure at least a year ahead, but ideally I would say by middle school or even earlier. And then let's see what else I have to add here. Okay, I think that's it for this one. I'm going to cover a lot more as we go throughout, so I want to make sure we have time to get through everything. The reality, though, is even if you do your best, which we all are going to do our best as parents with the knowledge we have at the time, children with disabilities are often described as falling off a cliff once they leave high school due to the failure of planning and implementation of effective transition plans. It's more than just the IEP is not effective or implemented appropriately. If the parents and the student don't know what resources are available to them once they age out of the school system, once they age out of the IDEA regulations, or if your state just doesn't have any of those resources, then you can really see that bigger fall. The more severe the disability, the more severe the fall I see. Transition plans often fail to meet even the basic legal requirements or address the particular and specialized needs of the student. What I see often with school teams is that transition planning is an afterthought. The IEP team focuses on filling in the transition pages of the IEP rather than treating this process as the primary focus that guides secondary special education service decisions. What I like to do is in California, and every state, every district IEP looks a little different, but what they do in California is they have the individualized transition plan, or ITP, at the very end of the IEP. It's literally after the notes. It's the very last thing in the IEP. It's the last 3 pages. And what I do is I rip it off and I put it right at the top when we start the IEP meeting. And I say, let's start with this, because at transition age, or whenever you've agreed as a team to start considering transition needs for the student and goals, that should be the forefront of the conversation. And what happens is it's often treated as an afterthought. Again, Congress, who have written all these laws to support these individuals, Congress stated there is an urgent and substantial need to maximize the potential for individuals with disabilities to live independently in society. That's what Congress said. But the reality is that there is no federal requirement for providing supportive services in adulthood. That's left up to the states. So again, it's important as families that you learn what is available in your state and that you know it before you leave high school. By the way, if anyone has questions throughout, you may put them in the chat. I will save a few minutes at the end of today's session for questions and more next week for this part 2. So before you start building your child's transition plan, it's really important to understand a few things. Self-determination is an essential skill for successful transition to adulthood. And what it is, it's about believing in yourself and knowing that you're capable of and allowed to make your own life decisions. Self-determination skills include goal setting, decision-making, problem-solving, self-advocacy, self-awareness. And there's research, the literature has shown that the correlation between early self-determination and post-school outcomes is very strong. So for example, there was a parent I talked with during the pandemic who was a single mom home with her child all day. She had had epilepsy surgery, this child. And because the mom was working from home and her daughter was schooling from home, the child was 7 or 8 years old and she did have multiple disabilities. The mom said, I have to work and you have to do your school. So she would set her up in the morning. She learned how to make her own lunch. She learned how to manage her own schedule, obviously with some supports, but there was a lot of self-determination, and self-advocacy and self-awareness that this young child needed to display in order for them to function during this difficult time. There weren't teachers guiding her through her day. Her mom could periodically pop out and give her some support. So just an example of there's lots of different ways we can start supporting self-determination for our young children. It's not really something that happens in a class. There could be a class on it, but it's really something that self-determination is really something that happens across the lifespan and really at home, I think. And then also you want to really understand person-centered planning, which means putting the person with a disability at the center of all decisions that are made about their life. So at transition age, the law actually requires that the student has to be part of the IEP process now, has to be invited to meetings, and that the IEP needs to be based on their stated strengths, preferences, and interests. So the law, that's one thing that changes at transition age. But regardless of their age, the student, no matter how significant their disability is the most important person involved in their IEP or their transition process. And students who are involved in setting their own goals are most likely to achieve them. When IDEA was reauthorized in 2004, that's when Congress emphasized that the student is the center of the transition planning process. They need to be involved in the process. And if they're not, you need to go back to your IEP team and say, hey, we need to do this again because my student should be driving this process. That should be happening as early as possible to get the student ready to actively participate in their IEP meetings or person-centered planning meetings in adulthood. That's the framework we use for my son now that he's out of his IEP. We use a person-centered plan for him to be still supported by a lot of people, but to be very much the center of all decisions that are made about their lives. Your child should really be receiving ongoing specific training to participate in their own IEPs. This is a really rich area for IEP goals. So self-advocacy and self-determination are critical life skills. So it might be something that's starting in 6th grade or 8th grade or 10th grade, whenever it's appropriate. The student is creating their own presentations for their IEP. Recently, I attended an IEP meeting for a young man who is nonverbal, has a very low IQ, and is, just considered significantly disabled. But with the help of his IEP team, he created a beautiful presentation to his IEP team where he talked about his interests and what he wanted to do and his future goals. And it was really wonderful. So sometimes these things are done in a supported manner, and sometimes they're done in a more independent manner. Another really important thing to think about when we talk about transition is I often see that families don't understand what diploma their child is getting. They don't understand the value of the diploma. I've had parents say to me, my child is a student of the month and is on the honor roll, but their student is in a special day class or a self-contained classroom where they are most likely working on modified curriculum and not working on a regular diploma. They're working on a certificate of completion or a certificate of attendance, that sort of thing. So it's really important that well before high school, you are very clear with your IEP team about what path you imagine your child will be on. I started talking about the diploma track for my son when he was in kindergarten or 1st grade, because I felt like there was a sense of he's never going to be able to do this because he has half a brain. So it's a tricky balance after epilepsy surgery, at least in my son's case, with so many disabilities, to say to the team, these are all of his needs and you need to support all of these needs. But by the way, I expect him to earn a diploma and go to college. It's a difficult balance, but it's not impossible because that's what we did. So you want to really discuss your child's graduation plan with the IEP team to make sure that it's appropriate for your child. The IEP team is responsible for determining whether a student will need to meet the state's graduation requirements or a modified set of requirements. But remember, who's part of the IEP team? The parent. You're an equal member of that team, an equal participant. And at transition age, the student is also a member of the IEP team and has to be involved in these discussions. In California, we have a base diploma that is not as robust as what we call the A to G diploma. It's a quirky California thing. But as a result of this, there's a new state law where they're trying to give students with more significant disabilities a longer runway to continue to learn academics. So for example, if your child is going into a post-secondary transition program, so after high school, they haven't earned a diploma, they get 4 more years of education through the school district, and generally the district will offer transition programs, 18 to 22 or 24, depending on your state. These programs tend to be focused on life skills, but there's a movement afoot, which hopefully will take hold, that says some of these kids just need a longer runway. They need to continue to learn these academic skills throughout their transition programming as well. And there's nothing in the law that says that shouldn't be happening. So on an individual basis, you can certainly advocate for that. And then the other thing to note is that you don't need to choose between a diploma and a life skills track, okay? So my son has both needs. He had multiple significant disabilities and he required a lot of life skills support, right? A lot of functional supports. But he also had the capacity, we felt, to earn a diploma. So we wanted him to go to a school that had the option for a regular diploma, the A to G diploma, that would allow him to go straight into a 4-year college, which again, that's a California quirk. So if you're not in California, it won't be an A to G diploma. You'll have to learn about your state's diploma types. And then I was told by our school, well, we can't work on functional skills then because he's on an academic track. Well, I love the law, right? So I went and looked at the law. And guess what? There's nothing in the law that says you can't have both. And as a matter of fact, it says from the first IEP, when your child is 3 years old, your present levels of academic achievement and functional performance have to include academic and functional measures, academic and functional goals, and that the outcome is, again, we're preparing the child for independent life to the maximum extent possible in education, employment, and independent living. So there's a lot of functional skills that need to be addressed throughout the IEP process through age 22 or whenever they age out. One other thing to note is if your child is on a diploma track and they earn a diploma and they turn 18, once they are 18 and they have a diploma, they don't have an option for the transition program, the 4 years after, right? So if you feel your child would benefit from the transition program, even if they're on the diploma track, you can slow things down a little bit. You can actually refuse the diploma and ask for them to be put in the transition programming if they haven't met functional goals. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about what happens at the other end when you receive your diploma and kind of some challenges that we see. And then there are other times where parents are just not sure and they think, well, I really want them to have the extra 4 years. But before you do that, you need to be really clear what's available in your district, right? A lot of these transition programs are cookie cutter programs and they're not appropriate for most kids, right? They fit a very small subset of kids. So you want to make sure that if you are trying to, stay in the program or extend the 4 years and try to hold your child back from earning the diploma, earning the credits to graduate, that you are doing so mindfully and that you're really aware of what is the program that you're holding them for, right? That was a conversation we had in our family. The other question is, how well should a child read or do math? What level of literacy and numeracy does your child need to function as an adult in the world? So according to the law, this is in two parts of the law, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and I think it's under ADA as well. There's a basic literacy and numeracy level required to be employable, which is English reading, writing, or computing skills at the 8th grade level, and the ability to compute, solve problems, read or write or speak English at a level necessary to function on the job, in their family, or in society. So some children might not ever reach an 8th grade level, that's fine, but they still need to be able to communicate with their family or in society, right? So maybe they have an AAC device, but if they're not being taught how to use that and how it's going to be functional for them, that could be problematic. If the student is capable and the team is not working towards at least this basic standard, this bare minimum of an 8th grade level of literacy and numeracy, then you need to have a conversation with the team. Again, that's why when I see kids getting to high school and being put in a life skills class and they haven't mastered literacy yet, I'm wondering why. Why are we not continuing to work on literacy for this individual or numeracy so they can have some basic functional skills? They should read well enough that they will be able to keep and get a job. And basic math skills are needed in order to function independently, to create a budget, manage your personal finances, split a check at the restaurant, count your change, all of that. 7th grade skills are required to participate in activities of democracy, so voting, reading materials about candidates, all of that. But 10th grade numeracy and literacy skills are required to enable an individual to safely manage their own medications and nutrition. And if the child has epilepsy and is on epilepsy medications or has to monitor their own health in some way, they might need numeracy, literacy skills at a higher level. So you might need to advocate with the school team to say, we need additional training for this child because they have this specific need. In order to function as an adult, they're going to need this skill. And then if they're going to college, they're going to need to understand college level text, read about 200 pages per week, and be able to clearly summarize a college level reading assignment. If your child's not going to achieve these levels, you have to think about what support will they need in their adulthood in order to function. Will they need support at medical appointments or to manage their medication if they're not at the level where they can read a prescription bottle or titrate doses or whatever it is going to be? The law says that at transition age, the transition services must be focused on improving academic and functional achievement to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities. So if the goals and services aren't successfully designed to launch your child into adulthood, then you need to get back to the IEP table or consult with an advocate or special education attorney. So this is the transition roadmap just to show you some steps in the process. It's very similar to a regular IEP roadmap. You're always starting with assessments. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Developing goals, identifying services, monitoring progress, updating progress, etc. So some differences at transition age. The transition assessment, quote, transition assessment needs to be done annually, not triennially or every 3 years. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. The parents and student must be notified and ideally prepared for the age of majority. So that's the age when they are a legal adult. In most states, it's age 18. And then, of course, there's graduation and aging out. I like to show this roadmap to remind us that in order to create a meaningful transition plan, in some ways we have to go back to the beginning, which is the assessments. And at transition age, it is, you really have to go back to square one, because think about it. When you do assessments on a younger child, you're thinking about what do they need for this coming year, right? When you're at transition age, you're thinking about their adult life. You're thinking you have a much longer view. So these assessments are going to be looking at things in a very different way. You really can't start the transition process without appropriate transition assessments. And if your child doesn't have an IEP, or you're homeschooling, or your child is done with this process, I still think using this framework can be helpful in any planning you have to do about the child, making sure you're always starting with what is the assessment say before you move on to developing goals or providing services. So the entire purpose of the IEP process is to prepare your child for life after high school. If you haven't gotten that message, I'm going to drive it home today. And transition planning is a legally mandated part of the IEP and should not be treated as a separate process. It is part of the IEP, which I've also mentioned. All of the rules, definitions, and safeguards of the IEP remain. The IEP must continue to provide free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, during the transition years, including through that transition program. So they can't all of a sudden decide academic achievement is out the window. They have to continue to work on that. And with the added obligation of assessing and addressing the long-term post-school outcomes. Transition planning is a very complex and dynamic process. It is not linear. It is not a straight line. There's going to be lots of bends and turns along the way. It should be very holistic, where you're looking at the whole child, not fragmented. One of the things I try to do with IEP teams, I do school trainings regularly. So if you need a training for your school team on their epilepsy surgery outcomes, I'm happy to do that. But I try to beg the team to work together, because school teams like to work in silos. Like, I'm the PT, so I'm going to work on the child's arm or their gait. I'm the speech therapist, so I'm going to work on speech. And we really need to be thinking much more holistically about a child, especially at transition years. The other thing I want to say is not to stress you out, but the IEPs developed during the transition years are the most important IEPs of the child's life, because they have the greatest impact on their future outcomes. So I know that by high school, most of us are like, oh my gosh, if I never have to go to another IEP meeting ever again for the rest of my life, that would be amazing. And we might be just kind of checked out and done. I know I was, and I had to really rally to pull myself back in and be like, no, this is important. I need to do this. So this is a time to kind of regroup and charge back up like you're starting kindergarten again. What we want to Transition planning is not looking so much as what can the student today, right now, but what could they do in the future with supports, right? And what are those supports going to be? And can we set those supports up now so that when we get there, like I said, everything is in place. We want to determine their potential and possibilities and make a plan for how to get there. So here are the parts of a transition IEP. The items in red are new to a transition age student's IEP and transition plan. This is all very similar to the parts of parts of an IEP, but we're going to add a few things. So the assessment, now it needs to be age-appropriate assessment related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills, which includes community access and recreation, and leisure skills based on the individual needs of the student, and that will be used to determine the measurable post-secondary goals. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on assessment, so I'm not going to go through that right now. Functional vocational evaluation, the law says if appropriate. I honestly can't think of a child who has an IEP where a functional vocational evaluation would not be appropriate. Schools like to say, well, that's only for certain children. That's for children with really severe disabilities. And then I see school teams working with a kid with very severe disabilities, and they say, no, a functional vocational evaluation is only for someone who's going to go into the workforce. So whatever you heard, it's not true. A functional vocational evaluation is available if appropriate, and I'm going to argue that every child with an IEP, it's appropriate. If the child has an executive function disorder, or maybe mild autism and an executive function disorder, they would get as much value from a functional vocational evaluation as any other child. All students with IEPs need a deep look at what they will need and what to do about it and what services in place now to have a plan. The vocational evaluation can also serve as a self-awareness tool and also as kind of a transition service, because generally a vocational evaluation, they're putting the student in a work setting or a simulated work setting to start to understand what their needs are in that setting. I will go have a little bit more on functional vocation evaluations in a minute, but I will say I would love to see that functional vocation evaluation done at the beginning of high school and at the end of high school, or at the end of the beginning of high school, the end of high school, and near the end of their transition program, to really measure progress and see how their needs are changing. The goals change. Another change at transition age is now we have what's called measurable post-secondary goals. Those are goals for life after high school. They're based on age-appropriate transition assessment. There has to be one measurable post-secondary goal in training and education, employment, and again, if appropriate, independent living skills. I'm going to argue always appropriate. So again, let's just say you have an executive function disorder. Do you need independent living skills training? Yes, because you can't plan how long it will take for you to take a shower, get your bag ready, have your cup of coffee, get out the door, walk across campus, and show up to your class on time with a homework assignment that was due when you're in college, right? If you have an executive function disorder. So yes, that would be independent living skills goal area. The annual IEP goals now support the measurable post-secondary goals. There has to be evidence that the measurable post-secondary goals have been updated annually, and they now need to be based on that annual age-appropriate transition assessment, which we'll talk about in a minute. Progress monitoring, always, we want benchmarks. We want to keep track of how the student is progressing towards their goals. The progress monitoring need to be specific and measurable. Supports and services are needed to help the student achieve their post-secondary goals through a coordinated set of activities. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. The student has to be invited to the IEP meetings. The outside agencies need to be invited to IEP meetings. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then there needs to be an agreement between the school and the outside agencies of who will pay for what and which services. All right. So step one is assessments. A good transition IEP is based on current, accurate, comprehensive assessment data. The assessment is how the IEP team, which now includes the student, knows what goals, services, and supports are needed. The data is the foundation of the student's transition plan. It's a critical step in the process. But now the assessment also needs to be looking at the student's stated strengths, preferences, and interests. I guess observed strengths and stated preferences and interests would be a better way to frame that. This is different from all of the other assessments because you are now looking at the child's ability to function as an adult. These evaluations are critical to successful transition planning because the failure to assess a student has been linked to a failure to provide services that meet the student's needs. Don't expect the IEP team to know how to do this properly. So last year or a couple of years ago, I spoke at a COPA conference in Boston with a vocational evaluation specialist, and we talked about how he had a student whose transition measurable post-secondary goal for transition for employment was, I will work at Starbucks. The child had misophonia, which is an auditory disorder that makes loud sounds pretty much intolerable. So he said, okay, let's take this kid to Starbucks and do a functional vocational evaluation at Starbucks. And they arranged to have him go in even at a quiet time. It wasn't even busy. I don't know if you've ever heard those espresso machines, but they're quite loud. And within 15 minutes, the kid wanted nothing to do with this place. But the school team was perfectly happy to have, yep, stated measurable post-secondary goal, Starbucks, right? But that wasn't appropriate. And until he was assessed appropriately with that functional vocational assessment, no one really knew that that wasn't appropriate for him, not even the student. Excuse me, I'm going way too far. Okay. So the law says that transition plan must be based on the child's performance, that age-appropriate transition assessment in training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills. Training and education are kind of lumped together. I don't generally see that broken out as a separate area. So it might be college, it might be vocational training, it might be something else, and then employment and independent living. So you're looking ahead at their future life. So education and training, college readiness, preparation for other post-secondary education like vocational, continuing, and adult education, career planning, trade school. What about their technological skills? Do they need financial literacy? Do they need communication skills in order to function in their desired job setting? Employment could include career exploration, planning, and readiness. That functional vocational evaluation might be included in the comprehensive transition assessment. I'm using that real or simulated work environment. And then independent living skills assessment looks at the life skills needed to be independent. So what are their adaptive skills? Do they have functional use of assistive technology? Do they have financial literacy and personal money management? Can they participate in community activities? Do they have the behavioral regulation to do that? If not, what's the plan to maintain that? I've been supporting a young man who just moved into a transition program, a friend of mine, her son, and they found out that for the adult day programs, he has to be independent in toileting, which he's not yet. So they're like, we have 4 years to get this guy independent in toileting so he can go into an adult program. So again, it's really important to know what's coming so you can start to prepare for it. So all of these things are part of that independent living skill set. What is a comprehensive evaluation at transition age? I don't know, because I don't know your child. It really depends on the individual. My son, due to his level of complexity, has had every evaluation, I think I'm looking here, every evaluation on this list. So at some point during his school career, his transition evaluation, both at 8th grade and more so as junior year of high school, included pretty much all of this. Your child might not need every single evaluation on this list. I would say any child with a neurological disability of any sort or neurological impairment of any sort requires a neuropsychological evaluation. It's different than a psychoeducational evaluation. We have some webinars on this. You can look under our IEP playlist, IEP Basics playlist on our YouTube channel. For a child who's had a hemispherectomy, for example, you have to have a central auditory processing disorder. You really need to understand the complex visual processing disorders that can be a result of that surgery. You want to make sure that there's a healthcare assessment, which I'll talk about in a moment. What about autism? I've seen a few girls in particular are diagnosed late with autism, where they got that diagnosis in high school because girls cover up very well for what are considered the typical autism presentation. But if you have an autism diagnosis, it opens the door to adult services. So what your child will need, I don't know, but your child should be assessed in as many areas as necessary to ensure that the transition services are comprehensive, to give them all possible chances for success. The decisions about what are appropriate measures and what areas of assessment, that should be determined based on the child's unique needs. The IDEA, again, the law says, quote, the school system must ensure that the evaluation is sufficiently comprehensive to identify all of the child's special education and related services needs, whether or not commonly linked to the disability category in which the child has been classified. So that means if your child has an IEP eligibility of speech disorder, right? They might still need an autism evaluation. They might still need a fine motor evaluation. They might still have an executive function disorder. We have to look at all areas of suspected disability. That's what the law says. I'm always going to go argue on the side of a neuropsychological assessment for a child with a neurological disorder. I really think both evaluations are needed because they're different. The school is responsible to evaluate your child in all areas of suspected disability. And if they have a neurological impairment, they need a neuropsychological evaluation. The school district is obligated to provide this. We have other webinars that explain that more. You can reach out to me. Brain-based issues mean they need a brain-based assessment. So a psychoeducational assessment is going to look more at academic knowledge, educational achievement, vocational skills, et cetera. The neuropsychological assessment is going to look at social, emotional, and adaptive functioning, general intelligence. What are the child's instructional needs, both for functional and academic instruction? What are their learning strengths and needs? What about attention, memory, language, their visual, spatial, auditory, not as detailed as a central auditory processing evaluation, etc. It focuses, the neuropsych eval focuses on the relationship between the central nervous system and the child's mental and physical functions. And neuropsychologists may use some of the same tests used by school psychologists, but they interpret the results in light of their special expertise in their brain behavior relationships. This report is your tool for understanding what the child's IEP should entail and how to teach him based on how his or her brain functions. For most kids who've had epilepsy surgery, insurance will cover this. You can work through your child's epilepsy center at the Children's Hospital. Your neurologist should be able to help connect with that. And there's also some other ways to get it, like I said, through the school district, et cetera. Very important evaluation, regardless of whether they're at transition age or not. Excuse me. All right. So academic and functional, I've talked about this a few times, but remember, we're looking at how they will function as an adult, which is what's different with all these assessments. The IEP team should always be looking at both academic and functional skills. That's what the law says, from age 3 to 22. At transition age, we need to be thinking about these functional skills even more, but not giving up on the academic if they have not been mastered. But I have seen kids who have graduated because they earned a diploma and have zero functional skills. I have a friend right now, her son is an adult, he just turned 26 years old. He earned a diploma, he was a great student in high school. He attempted college, it didn't work for him. He attempted jobs, didn't really work for him. And now he is laying on the couch at home, and he's 26, he's even aged out a lot of the post-secondary programs that might have been available for a young adult through age 26 for mild autism and executive function disorder. So if the child doesn't have the ability to apply their knowledge, you could be a straight A student and earn that diploma. You need the functional skills to be able to use that academic knowledge. So again, IDEA says a student with a disability must have academic and functional goals, and by transition age, measurable post-secondary goals in order to meet their unique needs and prepare them for that further education, employment, and independent living. So they have to be provided not only an opportunity to earn a diploma, which is a measure of academic success, but also to achieve functional and post-secondary goals. Academic achievement refers to the student's performance in academic areas like language arts, math, science, history. The definition can vary based on the child's circumstances or situation, but we're looking at basic academic skills that will help prepare your child to transition into the real world, including that mathematical computation, reading, writing, composition, keyboarding, or technology of any sort, and public speaking. And then functional refers to skills or activities that are not considered academic or related to academic achievement, although I think there's a close correlation, as I just mentioned. Functional is generally used in the context of routine activities of daily living. The range of functional skills is as varied as the individual, but they can include things like self-care skills, healthcare management, social skills, self-determination, mobility, time management, leisure and recreational, personal and safety, anything that helps the individual function in society. Behavior, I didn't mention that one. Let's spend another minute here on functional vocational evaluations. Special education and rehab literature supports that appropriate assessments lead to good transition plans. We've talked about that. There may be some disagreement about what the school calls a vocational assessment. They may call it a functional assessment, a functional vocational assessment, a functional vocational evaluation, comprehensive vocational assessment. It doesn't really matter what they call it. A vocational evaluation uses real or simulated work environments. That is where the assessment takes place to determine the support and training needs and potential appropriate settings for an individual with a disability. So my son has a pretty good memory on certain things, wrote things that he's memorized, and he's a people pleaser. So if you take him in a room that's quiet, with no distractions, no auditory impact, because he's got central auditory processing disorder, not a lot of visual impact, not a lot of people moving around him, and you sit him down and you ask him questions, he will probably answer what you want to hear. And you'll think, oh, this guy's really got it together. And then you're going to take him to Starbucks or wherever it's going to be and watch him make a purchase. Watch him interact with people in public places, and it's going to be very different, right? So assessing a child who's on the verge of adulthood, one-on-one in a quiet room, doesn't allow us a sense of what this child is going to look like as an adult in the real world. That's why we need a functional vocational evaluation in that real life setting. My son had his functional vocational evaluation during the pandemic. So the evaluator, we couldn't get him into a simulated, into a work environment, into a real work environment. The evaluator likes to work with local businesses and take these young adults into their work settings for maybe 2, 3, 4 hours, right? But that wasn't possible. But he was able to take him into the community. Watch, how does he cross the street? How does he navigate public transit? How does he make a purchase? How does he interact with people in the bookstore? There's a lot that you can see, right? So that's what we want. We want to see how they're functioning in a real world setting. The evaluation can be done by a number of different people. Unfortunately, there was new legislation that lowered the proficiency requirements for a vocational rehabilitation counselor, a voc rehab counselor. But according to the vocational rehabilitation counselor organization, they feel it doesn't meet their professional standards to address career planning and assessment. So you really want a qualified rehabilitation counselor, if possible, with a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling or a related field with a certification or license. I often see the school psychologist is doing a vocational rehabilitation assessment. One, they don't understand the child's disability, right? They don't know, they've never worked with a child who's had a hemispherectomy before or any type of epilepsy surgery. And two, they don't know the job market. They don't know the workforce. They don't know what jobs are out there. They don't know what jobs this child or young adult would be able to do. So that's why you really want to have a qualified assessor. At the end of the day, when we're looking at post-secondary education, employment, and independent living goals, the transition and career assessments will probably be done by multiple education and rehabilitation personnel who are all contributing. So it's really a multidisciplinary team approach. These are some of the things that a vocational rehab assessment, functional vocational assessment would look at. We're looking at the individual's interests, their aptitudes, kind of their abilities, their achievement, their values, their potential, what are they leaning towards, et cetera. What are the training programs that might match their needs? What strategies that supports the individual's needs and vocational interests? What are the accommodations they're going to need, or will they need a specialized work setting? And then what's their independent living capacity? All of these things will be considered by that functional vocational evaluation. Here's an example of some instruments. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them, but they will be in your slide deck. When you are working with your school team to determine the appropriate assessments, you will ask the team to see which measures will you be using, which evaluators will be doing these evaluations, and then look them up. Look up the assessments and say, I don't understand why you're doing a KTEA, a Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, and a career questionnaire online as a comprehensive transition assessment, vocational assessment for my child. That doesn't seem appropriate, right? You're the parent and student are part of the IEP team. You can step in and say, explain to me how this is an appropriate comprehensive assessment. Those questionnaires are not transition assessments. So many times I see school teams doing a career assessment and they are just, they're just spending 20 minutes talking to the student about what the kid wants to be when they grow up. And oftentimes they don't know. I know for my son, he was confused by some of the questions. He was bored. And he said to me later, I just picked random things because I wanted it to be over. It was not a meaningful evaluation, right? Whereas if we said he wants to work at the zoo and we did a functional vocational evaluation of him at the zoo doing different tasks, that would give us a lot more information. So if they do a career online career questionnaire or survey, you can say that was great. Now you still need to do an evaluation, because these instruments are self-reporting only. They're opinions, they're not evaluations. Very important. Transition screening, right, is just an interview with their high school counselor. That's not an evaluation. We want to make sure that they're actually getting a proper evaluation. I can stop here. We have 5 minutes left. If anyone has any questions, if you want to pop in the chat, or I can keep going until 10, and then we'll pick up next time. And like I said, we're going to leave about 20 minutes for questions at the next half. I see something in the chat here. Let's see what we've got. Okay, that's just nice to hear from you. So I'm going to keep rolling. If you have a question you want to drop in the chat, that's great. Otherwise, I'm going to try to wrap up the assessments section and we'll start with the rest next time. I'm hearing a keep going. So here we go. All right. So if you have a child with a complex medical history, like my son, who also has a shunt, had hydrocephalus, and he has a history of epilepsy surgery, right? So they're regardless of if his epilepsy is controlled, it's still a complex medical condition. He's left with hemiplegia and visual import issues and, all kinds of other issues. So the IEP team should be considering how their health issues might affect their employment choices, their education, their independent living ability, right? If you're not thinking about this stuff and you're not talking about it, you're not going to make a plan for it. So the teen needs to learn about their medical conditions and its symptoms. They need to understand therapy needs, such as the importance of ongoing physical therapy or stretching. They need to know what a medical emergency is and what to do, and when is it 911, and when is it drive to the urgent care, when is it go to the school nurse. They need to know what medications or birth control or recreational drugs might interfere with their epilepsy medication or other medications they're taking, or what might lower their seizure threshold and cause a seizure. Issues with substance abuse that are common in college, for example, or even in some workplace settings. What are the social support systems they'll have in place in their healthcare settings? What is the impact of their disability or their health needs on workplace stamina, their ability to interact with their peers, their attention span? And what is the transition to adult healthcare providers going to be like? So decision-making supports might be needed. Some young adults are unable to make informed decisions independently, and I'll talk about this when we get to that part. They may require significant guidance from caregivers, who the caregivers might require training now on how to support their child and guide the process. There is a part of the IEP that's parent training. So if as a parent you need training to support your child through this process, you can ask your IEP team for it. Most caregivers and youth with special healthcare needs are not receiving transition preparation of any sort. Some healthcare assessment could look at things like self-care, medical self-advocacy, or health literacy skills. So self-care skills, including health management strategies that they can start to use while still in high school. Transferring the responsibility for self-care to an adolescent is a very complex process. It requires assessing a variety of factors, including the child's needs, their health needs, their physical and cognitive abilities, how self-determined are they, plus family and cultural factors such as values and beliefs about healthcare practices and disability. A lot of young adults, when they go off to college, they don't want anyone to know they have a disability. They don't want to have any special anything. So they're going to need even more to have this stuff down so they can be safe, right? One parent said to me that her daughter went off to college and ran out of her epilepsy medication. And there wasn't a way to get it quickly to her at the school. And the mom had to jump through many, many hoops to get a delivery of her medication, but it took about 72 hours. And that's a long time to be off an epilepsy medication, cold turkey, right? Medical self-advocacy is the ability to understand your disability, your condition, your routine healthcare needs, to be able to speak up for yourself. Or to share, these are my needs. Like, I'm going to go in and I'm going to need a modified bathroom. I'm going to need you to speak slower, or you need to speak in plain language, like starting to teach them medical self-advocacy. This is what I'm going to say when I walk into the doctor. That could be a goal in their IEP, right? This is how I need to do this. And health literacy is the bridge between literacy and other skills and abilities of the individual. And in the health context, it is vital. So I think about health literacy. Remember, I said you need a 10th grade level to access medical literature, people making health choices every day regarding nutrition, general health maintenance, managing illness or injury, etc. They have to do many complicated tasks in order to navigate the adult health world, right? Just to manage their own personal health, forget a complex health. And then teens with chronic illness have to take charge of their health management. The health literacy limitations can make that really difficult. So it's a really essential consideration for transition planning, health literacy. The acknowledged definition of health literacy is the degree to which individuals can obtain, process, and understand basic health information and services needed to make appropriate health decisions. So now you're going to want to think of that in the framework of your child. So the child should have a complex, multidimensional set of knowledge and skills that they can use in many contexts. That's complex, right? So if you don't start working on this early, it might not happen by the time they reach adulthood. Literacy includes many skills beyond reading and writing. So you can see all the areas outlined here on the slide. I will not read it, but this gives you an idea of the complexity of that health literacy. I'm going to stop here. We're going to start here next week. We'll be meeting a week from today at 9 a.m. If you have any questions in the meanwhile, you should all have my email address right by now, and you can email me, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.